And when I try to explain that to them, they always say, okay, yes, that's what we need to do in the long run. But we have elections coming up right now, and we need to do something now. So what do we do? And I'm like, you're not getting it, right? It's so frustrating. But at the same time, I understand that most people don't think on the long term. They're always thinking on the short term, and maybe both things can coexist. You know, you do the intellectual work on the long run, but at the same time, we have to prevent some lunatics to go into power, right? And you need to have like a quick fix in order for that not to happen. And one example that comes into mind is the financial crisis of 2008. I don't know about you, but for the American friends that I have that are not involved in libertarian movements or objectivist movements, if I grab 10 Americans that I know outside of these movements and I ask them, was the financial crisis a consequence of capitalism? 9 of 10 are going to say yes.
Yes.
So that was a huge opportunity into educating people of the dangers of the central planners trying to control the economy. Why do you think it was lost, that opportunity? Why do you think not the libertarians, not the objectivists, everyone failed into making people understand that this was the government forcing the banks to give credits to people that were not going to be able to pay them. And that, of course, was a perfect excuse for banks to get corrupted. And not only that, when they had to like just go bankruptcy, they were saved with taxpayers' money. You know, it's like a whole cycle. And why do you think that happened?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. You know, for one, I think the left did a very good job of painting it with their version of events. So you're basically interpreting it from the lens of this is evil capitalists who brought down the system. So bankers and mortgage lenders and so on. And you know, I don't think, you know, first of all, free marketers were pretty small to start with. So it would have been pretty hard to have a voice anyways to try to get across these ideas. But even then, I don't think a lot of free marketers had the right ideas. So from my perspective, I interpreted the 2008 crisis from the lens of von Mises' business cycle theory, which is not even well accepted among conservatives and free marketers in general. So for example, Milton Friedman did not accept von Mises' business cycle theory.
Why?
Well, Friedman very much bought into the mainstream framework. So he buys into the equilibrium framework, the mathematical analysis framework. You know, he did introduce some, or I should say reintroduced important ideas like monetarism. So the idea that money supply causes inflation had kind of been lost through the Keynesian revolution. So he did bring those back into economics, which is valuable. But it was still all at the aggregate level. So he was basically taking the Keynesian framework and just putting a monetarist spin on it, which added some value, but he's still looking at aggregates. So from his point of view, if there's no inflation, then there's no problem. So all through the 2000s, there was no inflation. Inflation was low, even though we were having this massive bubble in real estate and in house prices. So mainstream people, even the free market mainstream people like the monetarists would look and say, hey, everything's fine. Where it's only with von Mises' theory that you can penetrate deeper and say, well, no, whenever you manipulate interest rates too low, that causes distortions, that causes an overinvestment in long-term projects, long-term businesses, you know, long-term assets and so on. And eventually that's going to have to reverse. So at some point, you know, interest rates were lowered to 1% in 2003 by Greenspan, which was an absurd level back then. I mean, now it's not so absurd. Things are even more absurd today than they were back then. People started borrowing like crazy to buy houses. House prices started rising 10, 15% a year. And then eventually interest rates went back up to 4 or 5%. So all these people, they wanted to get adjustable rate mortgages at 1%, 2%, 3%, because you know the interest rates were so low, but then interest rates go back up. Now all of a sudden they can't afford their mortgages. So house prices go down, banks had over-levered and over-lent and so on. And so it just kind of fed on itself that the distortions that were caused by the low interest rates you know, came to be seen. So initially they're invisible, but then eventually it all crashes, and that fits perfectly with von Mises' business cycle theory. But you know, unfortunately, it's not well accepted. So